Welcome to the Voice of Tamar. Here's your host, Vanessa Hobbs.
Hello, everyone. You are now listening to the Voice of Tamar with Vanessa Hobbs. Hello, Mrs. Hobbs. How are you today?
It's early, but it's great.
Of course, my name is Miguel, and it's a pleasure to be connected here with you today. This is the Voice of Tamar, the podcast that focuses on trauma, but not just trauma, but healing. Of course, we know there is healing beyond trauma. And if you did not catch the last episode, I'm going to encourage you to do so. Details in the show, no links. That goes over on what is trauma. We hear that word a lot, but oftentimes we don't talk about what it means. I thought that was a very insightful and good conversation that we had, despite the technical difficulties in the middle of the episode.
Man, it's crazy. My earring fell out. The router went out. It was crazy. But we have upgraded the router, and I have forgone the earrings for today.
There we go. Today's episode, we want to talk about trauma bonding. This may be a term you may be familiar with or not. I'll be honest, I had not heard about this term before. It was something that I started investigating, and I was like, this might be a good conversation for us to have. So Vanessa, given your background, given the deep dive that you've done, are you familiar? I mean, I'm just going to say yes, but I don't want to speak for you. Are you familiar with the term trauma bonding? Help us understand a little bit what it is.
Yeah. So, I have not been so familiar with it. I think that maybe the last year or so, I've become a little bit more familiar and begun to identify some of the patterns in my own life. It's very interesting, right? Because you hear about trauma a lot, and we hear about enabling people a lot. But I think that trauma bonding, being codependent, are not things that are often mentioned. So I think that this is going to be a great conversation.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the definition of trauma bonding. Again, if you're not familiar with what trauma is, maybe you're tuning in for the first time. Well, let's start there before we dive into this here. For those who are tuning in for the very first time and are asking themselves, who is Tamar? Because, well, I is not Tamar and you is not Tamar. But of course, we are talking about the Voice of Tamar. So let's, I guess, bring some context to the story of Tamar.
Yes. So Tamar is in 2 Samuel 13. I believe it's verses 1 through 13. But in the story, Tamar is the daughter of David, who is a great, great man. I mean, I think we skipped by it. I was actually having a conversation with someone earlier this week, and they were asking me about the topic and didn't even realize that the story was in the Bible. But David's son, Amnon, pretends to be ill. And he tells David, like, can you bring my sister here so that she can cook me food and feed me? I love her so much. She's so great, right? He's just talking about how great she is. And so not only did he want her to make her the food, but he wanted her to feed him the food. And at the point where she goes to feed him, literally feed him the food, he grabs her, he rapes her, and then he kicks her out. And it's interesting because as he's kicking her out, he's saying, this woman. So it was interesting. So she's crying and she's walking on the street and nobody hears her. And then we go to Deuteronomy, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the address at this moment. But when we go to Deuteronomy, it talks about a woman being in a field and being taken advantage of, and nobody heard her. And so my thought process was, man, I wonder what Tamar would say today. And there's so many other people who have been sexually assaulted and raped and don't have the opportunity to kind of share their experiences, or don't feel like they have the right to, or just don't know how. And so my hope is that in these last 6 seasons, something has stood out enough for people to realize that they do have a voice, and there are people to talk to about their experiences. And yeah, that healing just comes in layers.
And that verse, of course, is Deuteronomy chapter 22. I got you covered here.
He's a preacher. He's like, we need the app.
Deuteronomy 22 verses 25 talks about if a person hears the woman who have been betrothed, right? She has been defiled and she is crying out, someone's got to do something. And here we stand with those individuals male or female, that have been the voice of Tamar. Of course, in previous seasons, you sat down with even men who have spoken about their trauma. And so we understand that trauma hits all genders, all spectrums, all individuals. But let's talk about the definition of what is the word trauma bonding. This term was introduced by Patrick Cranes, PhD. He is the author of Betrayal: Bond Breaking Free from Exploitative Relationships and the founder of International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. And this term is fairly interesting.
Did your research?
Hey, I did my Google today. So the term is pretty interesting because one of the things that I found interesting was that, and by the way, Forbes has an article on this. We'll link that in the show notes. They have an article where they kind of go in depth as well. And there's a few other individuals, other articles that has been written. I'll also note in the show notes. But it's an interesting thing because oftentimes when we hear the term trauma bonding, we think that it's two individuals or more that bond over a traumatic experience, meaning you've been traumatically, you've suffered some type of experience that left you a trauma scar. I've suffered a situation that left me a trauma scar. And so we bond over the similarities. Individuals often think that that's what trauma bonding is. It turns out that's not what trauma bonding is. That's something totally different. To individuals that have faced trauma and bond, that's totally different than what we're talking about today. Trauma bonding is actually when the individual who has been abused creates a bond with the person who is provoking the trauma, who is actually causing the harm.
What? That's crazy. Yes. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. But it's a thing. It's a thing.
For sure. And so what we see oftentimes, and Katie Moore, she is a licensed clinical psychologist based out of California who specializes in trauma treatment. She says that trauma bonding happens when an attachment has formed between an abuser and the person who is being abused. And so again, this may be shocking. This may be something like, what? That's not going to happen. But but let's give some context to this. Maybe that sounds as in a stretch, as if that's not going to happen. But think about this. One of the relationships that I think many of us have formed in trauma bonding is, for example, with a parent or a sibling, an individual that causes harm, that causes abuse, that we justify them. We see this a lot even in domestic abuse relationships, where the female or the male, whoever is being abused, it simply justifies it and say, well, at least they love me. I know they're passionate, or I know that they're this. I know that they're that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an outside individual, or that, someone is being raped or something of that nature. It could be someone that is abusing the relationship. And in fact, what it is, one of the things is that it's an imbalance of power. So that is a very interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like a whole new revelation to me, because I thought trauma bonding was something different. I think it was what you first mentioned, what you felt like everybody else would think, but I know that this is a very common thing. I mean, think about it, when or if your parent or sibling, like you mentioned, has violated you, and they're still the one who's like cooking your food or providing for you, or maybe defending you against a school bully, but then still causing you a degree of harm, there is a bit of a conflict in your mind, because when you think about family and the way that families are kind of described for us, is that, family's family, and then you have to stick with them, and what happens in this house stays in this house. And because what happens in this house stays in this house, how do you even know what's normal versus abnormal? You're not walking around asking people, hey, does your sibling, does your parent do this to you when you're trying to sleep at night, And so that's I mean, it's a thing.
Yeah. And one of the, as I was kind of preparing for our conversation here today about this, I was thinking about it in the spiritual sense. We're both Christians, and many individuals who are listening right now may be individuals who are Christians, or B, are in some type of phase in their spiritual journey, right? In their relationship with God. And so I thought about it in the sense of how oftentimes when we do something that we know we not ought to do, right? When we commit a sin, right? At the moment, the sin may feel good. It's like eating a donut. I always attribute it to eating a donut. You could eat one donut, you're going to be all right. You can eat 2 donuts, you're still going to be all right. But once you start eating, the whole dozen, it's like, yeah, it ain't, it ain't gonna go well. And so I think sin is like that, where when you engage with it initially, you're scratching an itch that it is that sinful nature. But what happens is that as you continue to engage with it, you now begin to corrupt yourself. And here's the trauma bonding. The trauma bonding is, well, it's going to feel good, but that's going to make you feel real guilty. And then it's going to make you feel like, well, the only way for you to feel good is if you come back.
Yeah, I mean, I think mentally too, man, that has to be really tough. And I think for me, it can be tough. I think I've experienced trauma bonding in its actual definition in ways myself. And there is a bit of a conflict again, because the person who could be harming you could also be your hero. The person who's harming you can also be your provider. And so there's just a conflict that kind of comes with that, because, man, it's just, I'm learning more and more as I'm experiencing life, that a lot of things can be both and. And it's just tough. And it's not until you're really exposed to something that looks quote unquote normal, that is the way that things are supposed to be, that you realize some degree of dysfunction that has happened in your own personal life. And so for me, there are just things that have happened in my life that I kind of like observe other people's lives. And I'm like, man, and I'm not talking about from the outside in, because from the outside in, you can make anything look great, but you have experiences with other people and you're like, oh, I've always done it this way. And this way seems to be a little bit healthier, and this way seems to have a different degree of outcome. And so it really does mess with your head, and it takes some time to unweb and unknit yourself from a thinking process when you go into a type of trauma bond with people. And you talk about years or decades at times if you were a child when this happened. And so, yeah, I can understand the mental warfare that really comes with that.
Well, and it's like you just mentioned, right? If this is your environment, it's hard to determine or to say there's something better outside of this. And so while this is not the only form of trauma bonding, there are 2 types that we're going to talk about here. Again, this is not like an extensive list. This is very much an introduction to what trauma bonding is. But 2 forms of trauma bonding. One is intimate partner trauma bonding, right? So this refers to the bonding that occurs between 2 individuals that are in a romantic relationship. And then the other one, which we've kind of already spoken about, is that family trauma bonding. That's the type of bonding that occurs within family relationships, where a victim may form a bond with an abuser or neglected family member. It can involve feeling a sense of loyalty, obligation, or desire for approval. And so even though, my mom or my dad treats me like I'm no good, like I'm the black sheep, right? Like I don't belong in the family, but hey, that's my mom. And we justify it in that way.
Yeah.
I remember there was an episode a few seasons back where you spoke about how you presented the illustration of being invited to like a family barbecue. And you said, well, I have to make a decision to go to the family barbecue. And I am paraphrasing, but you said, I have to make a decision to go to the family barbecue because if my abuser is there, then now I have to decide, do I want to, break bread, so to speak, with the abuser, or am I going to not be there? I think many times individuals encounter that experience.
Yeah, I think I have to, and the tough thing about that is that think about it not just being a barbecue, think about it being a very special event. Think about it being a funeral, right? There's just this conflict because you're like, man, I want to support the person that I love. that isn't the person that I have experienced a degree of harm from, but they're still in relationship with that person. And so what I'm learning is that, like, hey, for me, somebody can be a villain, or for somebody else, they can be a hero, right? They did not experience that pain from that person. And so you just kind of have to assess where you are in your healing journey, because there were moments where for me, it was like, it's just not going to happen. I'm like in the thickness and the raw portion of my healing, and this could potentially create a setback, right? Because you have to go into these spaces with the thought that you might be triggered in a moment, or that further harm might happen to you. Or you make a decision to go and you kind of really stand on your boundaries to, not interact, or knowing that that interaction is not going to be harmful. And the thing about it is that for some people, you just cannot avoid the abuser, right? I mean, you can, but then it's like this conflict of, again, wanting to support somebody that you love. And so the question is like, what do you do to be okay? And this is next level stuff, right? So there are moments where it's like, man, I'm not going to be around them, and it just is what it is. But I do know people who have found themselves in a healthy space and do see their abuser, and they are okay, and they're not best friends, and they're not chummy, but they can stand the sight of them. And, the hope is to get there, but it is okay if you are not.
Mm-hmm. I am a Christian. I've I accepted Christ Jesus when I was 15 years old, and I'm mid 30s right now. So I wanna say that because I know that there are individuals that have experienced church hurt, and by no means am I the voice of Christianity. By no means am I, we didn't get together and say, yep, Miguel is our representative. That didn't happen. But I do strongly apologize to those who may have experienced church hurt. Of course, we know that by previous episodes, by your testimony. Those who are listening who are not familiar, please catch up with those episodes, because in your story, in your testimony, you talk about how some of that abuse didn't just happen on Evergreen, but it happened also in the church. And when we talk about trauma bond, oftentimes, we justify it that, it was the musician, it was the pastor, it was the leader, it was the this, it was the that, because of that unbalance of power. And that just can't be so.
Yeah. Yeah. When we think about what I just said about like knowing your strengths and where you're at in your healing journey, there's some individuals that I could probably see them and be okay. There's some individuals that if I see them, I'm not quite sure that it's going to go over well. And that is the case for the individual at the church. And I think and I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like I have to justify the reason why some people get a little bit more heat than others. But I think I do struggle with this idea of balance of power, right? And there's no difference in sexual assault, right? Please hear my heart when I say what I'm about to say. But I think that when you are two children, and there's some degree of age gap, and that older child has been exposed to something that they then victimize other people, I think that that's a little bit different for me. And I'm not saying bad or worse. It's just very different than an adult in their 20s, in their 30s, sexually assaulting a child. Because there's a degree of knowledge of right and wrong that you have. There is a degree of maturity that you should have. There's just a knowing that you have, right? And some people will be like, oh, but that adult might have been sexually assaulted too. And it's like, yeah, and so have I. And I don't make a decision to now sexually assault children at this good age of 33 because of what has happened to me. And so I always think about, like, if somebody comes to your front beautiful laid lawn with tulips that live for about 2 seconds and dump a bunch of trash on it, you don't just leave it there. it sucks. You don't prefer. Maybe you're a little bit angry, but hey, at some point you're gonna have to grab them little trash claw things and a bag and start throwing things out. And so for me, the excuse that somebody was sexually assaulted at a very grown, and them getting to a very grown age, and then sexually assaulting children puts a little bit more heat to my frustration. Now, granted, I'm still navigating that because I don't want to stay there forever. I don't want to be the kind of person who's imagining being explosive if I just so happen to run into somebody at a grocery store, but God knows where I'm at. And so by his grace, in this very small city of Rochester, New York, I have not run into that said individual because the Lord knows what I would do. And so I don't know how I got there, but I think that when we talk about church, though,
you turned a little Toby Ningwagwe. It's like some try Jesus.
Oh, don't try me. No. All of the heat. But when you talk about church, though, I think there's a lot of people who just will never come to church because of their experiences, right? And we don't stand as the representative and spokesperson for the church. But I think that my advice to those who have been harmed in church is to, man, really read your Bible and get to know Jesus for yourself. Because what happens when you come into a deeper awareness of who God is and what his nature is, you find yourself in places where, one, you know what to look for that might be unhealthy, but two, you begin to see God's character in other people. And maybe you take down this very tall list of perfection that we kind of put on people who have faith, because like I said, I'm a Christian and I love Jesus, but I'm not going to keep saying this because I don't want that to be my confession, but I'm still navigating forgiveness and full healing for certain situations. So it's like, even I am not perfect. And so this idea that sometimes is constructive for those who've experienced church hurt or who have had bad experiences with church people is that there would be this degree of perfection. And because you're not perfect and you've made a mistake, whatever mistake you made is very unforgivable. So I just want people to kind of deconstruct the church as a whole and really read the pages and see individuals who represent Jesus differently. So it's like, maybe that person wasn't a good person, but that doesn't mean that Jesus and the church as a whole is not.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the things I often say when we talk about the word church is that it breaks down in three different ways, right? So one, I am the church because Christ lives in me. Two, I go to church, and that's a reference to the actual local church, that building, that assembly, if you will. And then I'm part of the church. That's the universal church. That's all of the believers. And so oftentimes we have issues at the local level with the church, and we take it out on the entire organization. That is the entire body of Christ. That is the universal church. And so that's a good point that you're saying, right? You may have encountered one individual or one location that was not a good representative of the overall gospel of Jesus Christ. And so to you, I say, don't allow that one bad experience to ruin your possible experience with the Lord and that relationship. We definitely want to talk about and continue this conversation of trauma bonding. But if you're listening through Spotify, you can actually answer a question that we have there. Give us your definition or what you understood that trauma bonding was. If you're listening on Apple Podcast, go ahead and just leave a rate, a review, tell a friend, give us the 5 stars, 6 stars, 7 stars. How many stars we got to get?
A lot of them.
A lot of them. We need a lot. Give us all the stars you got. Be sure to share and become part of the conversation. Of course, if you have a question that you want to be answered on the podcast, you can send your email to thevoiceoftamar@gmail.com. That's thevoiceoftamar@gmail.com. We're talking about trauma bonding and what it may be. I want to give 4 signs of trauma bonding. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I want to add something to the last point we just made. I'm scrolling because apparently I watch a lot of YouTube videos, and I was trying to look for this title, but I think that just to the point of how we kind of make the entire church from one experience. I was talking to my therapist, and she sent me this video on Sunday morning. Ain't that crazy? On a Sunday morning. I'm like, girl, you have really invested in my healing. But it talked about the fact that at times what we do is we box a whole space, a whole situation or circumstance into one specific trauma that we had. So in this example, we use church, but I'm for the whole person. And so when you think about trauma, sometimes your experiences are like, I went to an amusement park and the seatbelt wasn't fully hooked in. I'll never go on a roller coaster again, right?
Mhm.
And so I think I want us to just make sure that when we think about church, when we think about life, when we think about travel, that we don't make one circumstance, one situation, like the whole picture for all things. Because then you find yourself blocking yourself from experiences and exposure that might make you a better, more healed and whole person. What were you going to say?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point and a fantastic segue. See, you ain't even know you ain't did it, but you did it, because one of the things that we do have to distinguish here, and a registered psychologist, Natacha Duke, she talks about this in an article with the Cleveland Clinic, where they talk about the difference between being in an argument, if you will, versus trauma bonding. And so she says the difference between bonding, or trauma bonding rather, and relationship conflict is this: conflict in relationship is normal and can usually be healthy if both partners are treated as equal and able to communicate and resolve the conflict in a respectful way. But in abusive relationships, the conflict often follows a pattern of gaslighting, manipulation, and blaming, along with power imbalance, end quote. And again, you can check out the show note links to check out that article where she talks about this particular difference, which is the difference we're talking about, right? It may be that, my wife and I may have an argument or disagreement. That's not trauma bonding. It may be that my mother and I may have a disagreement. That's not trauma bonding. It's when it drags out. It's when they start gaslighting and making you feel as though you're the issue. There was a study that came out years ago. Forgive me for not having the specific details, but it was very interesting because it showed this idea of gaslighting comes from this moment when the lights in the house were being played with. And so I'll explain what that means. There was this relationship where the man wanted to control his wife. And so what he would do is that he would mess with the lights so that they would flicker, almost like you would see in a lantern, the fire flicker. And so he would make the lights flicker, and she would say, "Sweetie, something is wrong with the lights." And he was like, "No, ain't nothing wrong with the lights." And something was wrong with the lights. And she would come back and he would, quote unquote, resolve the issue. "Oh, I found what was wrong with the lights." But then some time would pass by, and again, "The lights are flickering." He's like, no, the lights aren't flickering. And she would persist on to this until he made it seem as though that she was going crazy, that she was losing her mind, that she was seeing the lights flicker, but that they really weren't. In actuality, they were. He was playing with the lights to make them flicker. He was playing with the lights. And so we that's a very simple study that was done, a very article that was done. But the interesting about this is that happens in our life. Like, there are people that make situations happen and they almost make us feel like, "Nah, ain't nothing going on." It's like, "But you're talking to me kind of funny today," or "You're addressing me aggressive," or XYZ. It's like, no, ain't nothing happening. Nothing to see here. It's like, that's part of that gaslighting. That's part of that manipulation, that blaming, and that power imbalance.
Yeah. I think while you were talking about that, I've had situations just flash before my eyes. And when you say things like abusive, when you say things like abuser, when you say things like narcissist, when you say those kind of things, right? Sometimes the words are so big, or they've been used in such a negative way, that people just completely disregard them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I just want you guys to know, like, hey, this is a safe space. And I've honestly found myself in my own way being a not so great person, maybe having narcissistic behaviors, maybe having manipulative behaviors, right? Because you become what you see. And sometimes you have to work overtime to not do that. And so I want everyone to hear these words, and instead of just completely tossing them, hey, I'm admitting that on a recording that is going to go wherever it's going to go. But it's okay, because one of the things that I've learned I don't believe I practice this now, but when I was reading this book about being safe, about safe people, I started to notice some very unhealthy habits for me when it came to friendships and things like that. You have to highlight it and acknowledge it. And maybe you don't call it for what it is, but at least be aware enough that you make a decision to see it and acknowledge it and journal about it. Because one thing that happens when you identify that you have a bad habit and you like make a decision and a confession, like, I really want to change it, is that it's harder to do. I'm going to give you guys an example. I've been talking to my husband about just changing my diet. I feel crummy sometimes, and I know it's because I either didn't eat all day or have not had enough water. And so there's 3 changes that I'm trying to implement into my life right now: more water, no coffee, 3 meals a day, with 3 things. And so I usually drink coffee every morning. So when Friday hit, I'm like, man, I really have this taste for coffee. So I find myself not at breakfast, that's usually when it happens, but at lunch driving to Dunkin' Donuts, and I get myself a small frozen coffee. So I'm drinking it. And one in my mind, I'm like, I said I wasn't going to drink coffee, but because I had been so intentional and not drinking all week, I was only able to drink a small amount because there was a different kind of impact that the coffee had. Like, I don't even know if I like how it tastes because I've been drinking water so much. The coffee is very potent. It feels too sweet. And so it's like, that's the same thing when you begin to change a characteristic within yourself that you don't think is all that great. That even if you do try to step into those spaces where you're like, I really want to have my way today, so maybe I'm going to be a little bit manipulative. It's like, nah, but I've been consciously trying to make a change in that area. So how about I figure out a different way to communicate my needs? And so those words, again, narcissistic and all the negative, characteristics that we tend to have in moments, and they're not titles, but we carry or we exhibit those words, can be changed. You just have to discipline yourself and identify that it is a thing.
We definitely want to provide strategy, right? You that are listening and saying, okay, fine, I understand the difference between, maybe having just a conflict resolution with my significant other or family member and versus having an actual trauma bond, right? Understanding the difference is necessary. We don't want to leave you there. We actually want to provide to you some strategies so that you could, in fact, if you're going through this, be able to try to discern, and as you were mentioning, lose that appetite of maybe staying in those situations or those traits or attitude. So the number one thing is, surprisingly enough, keep a written record, write a journal, because truth be told, emotions can get in the way and we may lose the reality of what happened. And it's like, I remember when I was a child and I used to sit on the floor in the basement. My stepfather had prepared the basement where there was a rug, there was a TV, there was a couch. And then the TV was one of those TVs that sat on the floor and you had to get up and kind of crank it whenever you wanted to change. It's like, you can think about that and there's such nostalgia and emotion. And it's like, man, I remember those days. Those were simpler times, we say. Those were much more beautiful times. Truthfully, it was annoying having to get up and crank that TV, but we remember it with such fondness. And what happens over time with certain experiences is that we don't realize it, but we kind of change the narrative of what actually happened. And so a situation where it was abusive, we may switch it and say, no, it was just a passionate moment. After all, it did lead to a makeup. It did lead to something beautiful. And it's like, no, you're missing the truth of what happened. So write record, journal, write it down. Today, this happened, so that if it happens again, it'll be much easier for you to follow the thread of what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I've had to do that too. It's like, man, I remember those good moments. It's like, yeah, but what about them bad ones? You need to write about those bad ones too. So it's like, yeah, facts over the feeling.
Facts over feelings. And number 2, what you can do, strategy to overcome this trauma bond, to recognize it, to recover from it. Number 2 is surround yourself with loved ones. Remember, you've mentioned this before, where it's like you didn't have sufficient faith or you didn't believe enough. And so you surrounded yourself with people that did have faith, did have the belief, and that actually woke in you the belief of essentially a better life.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you have to do that with the effort to actually be investing and becoming better too. Because you don't want to be complaining about the same thing that you're trying to work through for the next 10 months. It could create an imbalance in friendships. But yeah, sometimes you have to surround yourself by people who believe in you and will remind you and hold you accountable to what you said you wanted to do and accomplish.
Both Vanessa and I have found great, what's the word I'm looking for? Great solace, if you will, and pleasure in being in the church. We don't attend the same local church, but we are part of the body of Christ, part of that universal church you spoke about. And we've found great support in going to church. And that actually brings us to point number 3 here on the strategies on how to recover and treat trauma bonding, which is join a support group. And so that may be a church, that may be some sort of activity group, some sort of Facebook group, some sort of group that you can surround yourself with people, as I say, surround yourself with people that nourish your vision. And the 4th thing that we'll talk about here with reference to treatment and recovery is practice self-care. What this means is cut off those individuals, cut off those relationships, get familiar with you, initiate a relationship with you. And of course, if you are a victim of domestic violence, then, I want to definitely encourage you to check out the National Domestic Violence Hotline. They also have a website, but you can call and contact the National Domestic Hotline, and that's 800-799-7233. Again, that's 800-799-7233. That's the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you're going through a situation, they are available 24/7, 365 days. I should say 366 because that includes leap years. But the truth is that the feeling that you're alone in your trauma can make that situation even worse. And the truth is you are not alone.
Yeah, and please find yourself in a position where you are no longer explaining yourself. If you've noticed that somebody has a very toxic behavior and they manipulate you or gaslight you into staying every single time they do this, you need to remember the 5 times they did it. And so you don't really need permission from somebody to walk out of a situation that's unhealthy.
In the life of Tamar, her brother is the one who causes an imbalance of power.
Mm-hmm.
In the life of Tamar, her brother is the one who's making her feel as though she's not a good enough sister. In the life of Tamar, it's those situations, that moment, and it's the moment that leads to a very difficult one. Hey, you've been listening to The Voice of Tamar with Vanessa Santiago. I'm Miguel Lebron, and we today have been talking.
Santiago.
Oh my goodness gracious.
So easy, it just rolls out.
Set the record straight.
Vanessa.
Vanessa Hobbs. Yes. Hey, we're gonna leave that blooper in there. Vanessa Hobbs, the host of The Voice of Tamar. If you want further information, please consider checking out the show notes links. Of course, make sure to visit vanessa-santiago.com where you can find further resources. It's important to surround yourself with people that would nourish your vision and to understand that there is healing beyond the trauma. Final words?
Yeah. Heal, man. You deserve it.
Hey, that's a good one. I'm not even going to add nothing else, even though I'm still talking. So kind of adding, heal, man. You deserve it. Quote, Vanessa Hobbs.